Hey everyone, got a new video to look at. It is new survey results for the Druid and Paladin Unearthed Arcana, so I'm going to react to it. This will be my first time watching. And before I do that, I do want to just give a little bit of housekeeping, I guess, or explain what's coming, because there's going to be a survey on the most recent playtest that I believe opens on Wednesday. And I will not be doing my standard is I'll fill in the survey on day one. Then I usually release a video showing me doing that survey like right afterwards. But I will be waiting a little bit longer to do the survey this time. First off, I have a 1D&D playtest scheduled, and I'd rather have the playtest done before I do the survey, so I have some actual experience. And secondly, I actually have a couple more videos planned for the playtest that's going to give some other perspectives on the playtest and where we are so far, and it's going to provide context to the answers I give on the survey. Also, when I do the survey video, I've always just kind of recorded myself doing the survey, and then I just do kind of a live feed of it. I think this time I'm going to do a more summarized version where I just relay what my answers were and what my comments were, and I'm going to give a copy of those comments. Some people have asked if they could have a copy of them so they could reference them if they fill out in their own survey, so I'll do that as well. But just expect that my survey video will be a little bit later than usual. It won't be right after the survey is released on Wednesday. So let's get into this video and see what they got to say about the Druid and the Paladin. I mean, I think we got some idea what they're going to say about the Druid.
Recently, we've been able to look at the results for Unearthed Arcana about the Paladin and the Druid. What did we find out?
So this survey again got tons of responses. So first off, thank you to everyone who filled out what I know is a long survey, and it is worth it because this feedback is so informative for how we proceed with the design of each of these classes, each of these subclasses, and the rules and other elements that are present in this playtest. So what we learned with the Druid and the Paladin is super informative. I'll start with the Paladin. The Paladin overall did extremely well in terms of satisfaction. So we saw with the Paladin that every single feature in the class, as well as in the subclass, scored 70% or higher.
Wow.
In the base class, the lowest scoring thing was Divine Smite, and that was at 72%. And for anyone who hasn't...
Okay, so not surprising to see the lowest scoring thing was Divine Smite, because Divine Smite had more changes than most of the other features did. So you could Divine Smite with ranged attacks. That was a big thing. You were limited to one smite on your turn. That was a big change. I think you couldn't cast a spell on the same turn. That was also a change. So yeah, I'm curious. It's one thing to say that it had a lower score. It's another thing, what exactly were the people's issues with Smite? Because it could have been one of multiple different things.
Hasn't been with us for one of these videos before, we consider 70% or higher to be passing. Now, that doesn't mean it's fine as is. We're always iterating and seeing how can we make this more fun, make this better. But it's telling that in the Paladin, that was the floor. And the scores then went up in a number of cases up into the high 80s, close to 90% satisfaction. And so what that, from a quantitative standpoint, tells us is the overall mood about the playtest Paladin was positive. Now, that's only part of the story, because the qualitative feedback we get, the written feedback, is critical. And so as we began digging into the feedback, and members of the team are continuing to ponder different aspects of it, we see a number of things there. Like one, for example, is many people really loved the addition with Divine Smite of being able to punch smite.
Yes.
But there is a fair amount of resistance to paladins being able to smite on ranged attacks. And actually, the resistance is not surprising because it's about class identity.
Yeah.
And class identity is important to all of us who really love a particular class. And there are a fair number of people who feel like that was a bridge too far, that paladins being that effective at ranged attacks starts making them feel like clerics when compared to another divine spellcaster, and even starting to move into ranger territory.
All right. So I first off, so it sounds like the once per turn thing maybe wasn't a big issue. It was the ranged attack thing. And I thought it's interesting he mentioned class identity because that was one of my major concerns about the Paladin is a loss of class identity. And this actually wasn't even really about Smite so much, though I guess Smite was more of an issue with class identity for the Ranger, like he just mentioned. But I noticed he mentioned clerics as well, and that's where I saw a real issue with class identity because we had all these Smite spells, and great spells. Really enjoyed the redesign of the spells. The issue is, with them being now divine spells, and the Find Steed spell now being a divine spell, it meant that clerics not only got access to all these spells, but because clerics are full spellcasters, they got access earlier, and they could upcast more. So they actually are better at those spells than paladins are. And when you have things that are kind of iconic to the paladin, and another class does them better than you do, that's a problem. That shouldn't be the case.
So that's feedback we take seriously because sometimes, even if the math of the game tells us it's okay to do a particular thing, in D&D that's only part of the story because so often it's the narrative that's the most persuasive. It's the identity of something that really captures our imagination. And a lot of commenters on the Paladin bring up that for them, the Paladin, and they're not wrong, has traditionally been a melee class. Also, a lot of great specific feedback about other details in particular features of the class, and a lot of positive response to the redesigned Smite spells. And in fact, people were wanting to see the new versions of the Smite spells possibly integrated into the class more. And that is something we will be exploring in the next version of the Paladin. Of just as we did in the recent Mage playtest, look at giving the Paladin some of these spells as Paladin exclusives.
And that's unsurprising. So as soon as I read the most recent playtest packet, it was clear to me that class identity was a priority, and it clearly wasn't a priority in the previous Unearthed Arcana, the Druid and Paladin. And I was thrilled to see that switch in direction, and I would only expect that that will filter back into previous playtests, like making Paladin spells Paladin exclusive spells.
Many people, understandably, associate those spells just with that class. Now, the Druid was another story, and you and I have talked in another video about we knew that the...
All right, so the Druid, of course, if you were at all aware of the online response, the wild shape feature of the Druid on the playtest version was reviled. Okay, so they switched wild shape so that when you used wild shape, you accessed a template. The template had no customization options whatsoever, and it used your own hit points and brought your armor class down and prevented you from casting spells. And so it was just an option you would never, ever want to use. And I know that some people don't like templates and other people do, and I like templates, but I still didn't like this wild shape because although it was a template, which I like, it needed to have customization options within the template. It didn't have that, and defensively it was way too weak. So it just didn't accomplish what it needed to. Now I'm curious whether they're going to abandon templates altogether or they're going to simply redesign the templates so that they're better. But I guarantee you it was not popular in the survey.
The Druid response was going to be mixed. We knew this for historical reasons. In the playtest Druid, we tested out a different version of Wild Shape that relied on these generalized templates rather than specific beast stat blocks. It's something we tried 10 years ago in D&D Next, received a mixed response, so we didn't go in that direction. But then in the 2021 Player's Handbook survey that we did, we saw quite a few people asking for a design direction like that. So we decided to give it another go. But we knew, because past is prologue, there was a higher than zero chance that it wouldn't be the direction that the majority of Druid fans wanted us to go in. And sure enough, we are seeing that in the feedback to Wild Shape, there are basically two camps. There are people who have written in the comments, and I'm looking at the written report here that our staff provided with me, with quotes from fans saying this is their favorite version of Wild Shape they've ever seen, paired with people who, in contrast, said they never want this Wild Shape to appear in print.
Now, two camps, totally get it. I very highly doubt they had a huge amount of responses saying it was the favorite version of Wild Shape they had ever seen. I know I said I like the direction, but this doesn't work as written. You need to do more with it defensively. You need to give it more customization options, but I like the idea of templates. But in terms of, liking templates and not liking templates, that's definitely two camps. But I think even most people who like templates didn't like these templates.
And the people in that second group outnumbered the people in the previous group, although it wasn't a huge sort of runaway thing. It was like, it's similar to when we think about the number of groups that use feats and the number of groups that don't. It's just a simple majority, it's like just over the line of 50%. So in many ways, this is ending up where you and I talked about it probably would end up in one of our other videos when we were sort of prognosticating how might the Wild Shape feedback go. And really where it's going is people love the texture and differences that are present among the different beast options in the 2014 Wild Shape. But even the people who like that form of Wild Shape are open to the feature being a bit easier to use. Because as you and I have discussed in a video about the Druid, making Wild Shape easier to use, that's our main goal here.
Yeah.
We're not actually wedded to a specific implementation in terms of like the exact stat blocks that are being used. Our main goal is just simply we no longer want to be asking a brand new player or even a veteran player who's strapped for time to go ponder 100 stat blocks and decide which.
So I can predict what the next Druid will look like. I, of course, have no inside information, but my assumption would be, based on what he said here, is that Wild Shape for the next iteration of the playtest will have a Wild Shape that looks more similar to what we have now, in that you will be using specific stat blocks with it, but I bet you there is a curated list of stat blocks to access. That would be my guess.
Which one they're going to turn into. And so that's what we will work on solving. And the next time the Druid appears in Unearthed Arcana, everyone is going to get to see an entirely different take when it comes to Wild Shape that addresses the feedback that we got here. Now, in the Druid feedback, most of it was about Wild Shape, but we did see some interesting commentary about other things that we were exploring in the Unearthed Arcana. One of those was people really liked the promise of channel nature, this idea of using what was formerly just uses of wild shape for more than wild shape, which is actually something we've already been doing in Druid design for a while. We, in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, had subclasses where the Druid could use wild shape for something other than wild shaping.
Yeah.
Channel nature is just that with a different name. But as much as people like the promise of channel nature, the feedback is they'd like to see us do more with it. I love that kind of feedback.
Yeah, so channel nature is the way that the Druid now accesses their wild shape, and they were given one other option, and I think it was called Wild Blossoms or something like that, and it was a healing feature that didn't really scale with your level. And so there wasn't really a point in using it at higher levels, and eventually it happened automatically when you wild shape. So there came a point where it wasn't really a separate feature at all, so there really was no options. So it is unsurprising to me that people are in favor of the idea of channel nature, but they saw these two options and felt that we really need better, more impactful options, like real options.
If essentially the feedback is, we're not super happy with the
I should mention you could do Find Familiar as well. If I don't mention it, somebody will say I forgot to mention it.
version here, but we like it, so please give us more with the following feedback. We will absolutely do that.
Great.
Now, the feedback on the Circle of the Moon Druid, very interesting feedback. Some of it I expected and some of it I didn't. I came to the feedback wondering, for instance, is there going to be a lot of requests for being able to turn into elementals again, since that was a function, just as one example, in the 2014 Circle of the Moon Druid. The piece that surprised me is that was not a major theme, but rather people wanted us to go a little further in the redesign to really lean into sort of the lunar aesthetic of the subclass.
That's really interesting. So normally on any survey, my expectation is the bigger the change, the less people will like it. And it doesn't even really matter what the change is, or whether the new version is better or worse than the original. People don't like big changes. And removing the elemental wild shape was a pretty big change for the Moon Druid. And it's just really surprising that not only did players not mind not being able to access elementals, but they kind of even were talking about, hey, it's a Moon Druid. How about having it be more about the moon, and what do elementals have to do with the moon? That's great feedback. I'm just surprised that it happened.
In other words, it was people wanting the subclass to be a bit more internally coherent.
Right.
And also, when it comes to wild shape, desiring for the forms to be resilient so that the Circle of the Moon Druid can continue to function in melee without being afraid of being squashed.
Now, what I hope they don't do is just revert it, because Moon Druids as is don't really work at all, because at level 2 they're already broken, right? You can turn into forms that have more hit points than your Druid does. In fact, you can turn into forms that have more hit points than the Barbarian does as a wild shape multiple times per short rest. I really hope they don't go back to that. And also, of course, at 20th level, you get this capstone where you can wild shape an unlimited number of times, and then you can get like 100 and 200 hit points every single turn you have. And so that is no good either. So as much as I appreciate that they're talking about a change in direction, I hope it's not reversing back to what we had.
Too easily. We hear that feedback. We will absolutely respond to it, while at the same time not bringing back the runaway power that the Circle of the Moon Druid could have at high levels in the 2014 version.
And what made that?
Not high levels, all levels. In fact, it was worse at level 2, right? Level 2 might actually be the worst level of imbalance in runaway power levels, and actually that declines as you go up in level until you hit level 20. But I'm glad they're not reverting.
Runaway power.
So one of the main reasons is that at high level the Druid got unlimited uses of Wild Shape.
Okay, so that was broken.
For the Circle of the Moon Druid meant unlimited hit point recharges, because every time you entered a new form, it meant you got all of the hit points of that form. But even before you got unlimited versions of Wild Shape, you had enough uses of Wild Shape and enough forms you could turn into with large hit point pools that it made it very difficult for dungeon masters to make Circle of the Moon Druids feel threatened in any way, because of this ability to just essentially hit the Wild Shape button and sometimes get more hit points than the Druid themselves had. And so that will be reined in however the Circle of the Moon subclass ends up, and as we go through the feedback. And that will be a common theme with some of the...
So his comments thereafter saying it was a high-level problem, all the comments after that are totally on point. It's the only issue I had with what he said there is him suggesting that Moon Druids were just a high-level problem. They're a level 2 problem, and there's a lot of levels where they're actually not a problem at all. But at level 2, they're a problem. At level 20, they're a problem. And the points he makes there are all accurate points.
The things that we do, we will absolutely incorporate as much feedback as we can, but there are going to be some places where things simply, the balance needs to be corrected. And this is one of those places we talked when talking about the sorcerer, that like twin spell is an example of something that needed its power adjusted. What's cool is there aren't actually that many.
There is a really nice thing he's saying here. He's saying there's things that have power levels that just are not appropriate, and we don't care what the survey results are. We're going to adjust those power levels. Great. That's great news, because that's one of my chief concerns about this whole design by committee process that we seem to be in, is that people like powerful options, but some things are too powerful and need to be readjusted so that they don't, overshadow other things. And I'm glad that there's a commitment on their part that in some cases they're not going to back down. They might try different versions, but we're not going to see things like Wild Shape for Moon Druids at level 2 like it was in the 2014 Player's Handbook, no matter what our survey responses are. So that's terrific. And when you get to the Simulacrum spell, Jeremy, that would be another one.
Many things like that. Most things power-wise are where we want them to be, and it's much more about finding ways in which we can make them even more fun, even more true to the identity of the class or subclass, and where possible, seeing how we can make them even easier to use.
Isn't necessarily applicable to the survey results, but you mentioned like you don't want a class to necessarily eat someone else's lunch. Like the Paladin, some people notice that maybe being able to smite with a ranged weapon kind of intruded on kind of the theme and feeling of the Ranger. Is that true for subclasses as well? Because we've got something like the Arcane Archer for fighters that's got a little bit like, okay, I'm a pretty good archer, I'm kind of in the range of a Ranger.
There's lots of subclasses out there that are like a little bit of some other class. Like the first one that comes to mind is Arcane Trickster. So if you're a rogue and you select Arcane Trickster, you're going to get a taste of being a wizard. You're not a wizard by any stretch, but you get a taste. And there's a huge difference between a subclass giving you a taste of something else or a feature that overshadows the original. I don't think giving you a taste of something else is a problem at all. Giving a subclass as an alternative to multiclassing, I actually support.
Kind of
So subclasses, by their very nature, are meant to give you either a taste of something that no class has, or they're meant to give you a taste of something that's in another class. So it's actually intentional in subclass design.
Yeah, it's certainly not every subclass that gives you a taste of a different class. It's there's lots and lots of subclasses that just do something entirely new.
That occasionally a class, through that subclass, will get the feel of another class in the game. We don't do that with every subclass, but that absolutely is the goal with some of them. The main thing we don't want to do is have base classes that are eating too much of each other's lunches, even though there is a lot of shared tech and story among the classes. Like an example of this is we have multiple classes who have the fighting style feature, for instance, and it's appropriate for each of the classes that have it. But then we made sure that each of the classes that have that shared feature have other things that those classes alone have. For instance, of the classes that have the fighting style feature, only the Paladin has lay on hands.
Right.
Only the hunter has, I'm sorry, the ranger, not the hunter subclass, but the ranger class. Only the ranger class has their favored enemy mechanics.
And there's a little bit of history of like also like when you have Eldritch Knight, this is kind of like the fighter mage, and then you have Blade Singer, which is the fighter mage but more mage than fighter.
Yep.
That kind of like connective tissue between two, maybe even opposite classes.
Yeah, exactly. And those.
It's not exactly the example I would use, because Eldritch Knight is a far cry from being a wizard. Blade Singer is kind of encroaching on being as good a fighter as a fighter, plus more stuff. But that's another topic.
Those two are prime examples of a subclass that is intentionally giving you some of the feel of a class that is other than the one that contains that subclass. Yeah, because Eldritch Knight gives you a sampling of wizard, and Blade Singer gives the wizard a sampling of fighter.
And that's it. Okay, so just to wrap up, Wild Shape not being popular is no shock. I do think we get a pretty good idea of what we'll probably see as a replacement. And then it looks like range attacks will likely be going away on smiting for paladins. That's not a huge surprise either. It looks like the Paladin spells are going to become Paladin exclusive spells, which is good. Yeah, so the survey is doing its job. We see these things, we have our problems with them. They get the survey results and they change things, and that's what we want to see. So I will be doing a little bit more playtest content here in the next few videos I release. And then I'm going to resume, finally, my series on the race tier charts. So hope you'll join me for that. Talk to you later.